About that early novelty, before it culminated in something as useful as a feather, where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cells saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful.
Richard Dawkins' faith in natural selection is bolstered by the fact that, as Darwin noticed, the painful details hardly support the idea of a benevolent designer.
I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that God would have designedly created that a cat should play with mice.
Darwin's own religious faith had slowly ebbed away over the years, but that was due as much to the death of his daughter as to his scientific ideas. But for a variety of reasons, not least of which was the fact that his wife was still deeply religious, and he himself, of course, realized the theological implications of his own theory, Darwin resisted publication of his work for almost 20 years. It was only when another, younger man, Alfred Russel Wallace, submitted a work with almost exactly the same scientific conclusions that Darwin was pushed into publication, and as he feared, the reaction was dramatic.
Is it on his grandmother's or his grandfather's side that he claims descent from a monkey? There is a metaphysical part of nature. A man who denies this may sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since written records began.
For understandable reasons, the established church was appalled by the theory of evolution because it denied the very idea of an inaugural creation in which all natural forms had been established from the outset. And as far as the clergy were concerned, what was even more shocking was the idea that man was included in this process, and that as a mere descendant of apes, he had lost his curious spiritual priority. Man was no longer the star of this cosmic event.
When you consider the relative ease with which educated Christians, as we've already seen, had been able to reconcile their beliefs with some of the new astronomical discoveries, it's not altogether surprising that, with the exception of ignorant and stupid fundamentalists for whom Darwinism is a blasphemy, there were, and still are, religious people willing and able to accommodate the now undeniable Darwinian proposals. But the point is that the religious now had to visualize the architecture of living things in an altogether new way. One in which God could no longer be represented as an ever-present, pedantic designer. But while the religious view of God was growing more attenuated, those who took a skeptical and radical view were feeling more and more confident. The leadership of the skeptical and radical reformers was now undertaken by George Jacob Holyoake, and in his journal, The Reasoner, he coined a new word to describe a belief system based upon reason and science.
He called it secularism.
Well, by the middle of the 19th century, there were more than 40 secular societies in Britain, and Holyoke's journal was selling more than 5,000 copies a week.
Secularism was hugely popular throughout the 19th century, and the National Secular Society still exists in the 21st century, here in Conway Hall in London. After Holyoke, the leadership of the secular societies fell to Charles Bradlaugh, a radical MP famous for being expelled from Parliament and briefly locked in the Tower of London for his failure as an atheist to swear on the Bible his oath of allegiance. Bradlaugh secured the right, which we still enjoy, for every man and woman in this country to affirm an oath rather than having to swear on the Bible. At the turn of the century, one might have been forgiven for thinking that disbelief would soon triumph, that religion would soon fade away and die. Nietzsche had just said, amongst many other things, that God was dead. So why should faith survive? But by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, there emerges a man who claimed to understand the origins of religion, of all religions. Sigmund Freud. Although Freud was by no means the first thinker to try and explain the psychological origins of religion, his account is perhaps the most systematic attempt to represent faith as something fundamental to early human mental development.
Well, Freud, like me, came from a Jewish background, although for obvious reasons he was much more explicitly aware of it than I am. Even so, Freud never really identified himself with the religion itself, and as a student of science, he became increasingly suspicious of religion as a whole. And with the development of what became psychoanalytic theory, he began to recognize that the belief in God, that's to say in some sort of supernatural agency to which human beings were answerable, was the inevitable result of the infant's helplessness and his relationship to the apparently all-powerful figure of the father. Look, this is what he says about it in his book called The Future of an Illusion.
The rest of our inquiry is made easier because this God creator is openly called Father. The psychoanalysis of individual human beings teaches us that the God of each of them is nothing other than an exalted Father.
So he saw religion as an illusion. Now, although he describes this as a wish fulfillment, it's quite difficult to see it entirely in that light, since the figure created by the infant imagination had punitive as well as benevolent characteristics.
But however Freud explained that apparent contradiction, it's quite clear that he saw religion as false and profoundly unhelpful.
Religious teachings are neurotic relics, and the time has probably come for replacing them with the results of the rational operation of the intellect.
For obvious reasons, Freud's theory disconcerted the conventionally religious. But the social implications of his theory were trivial in comparison with the politically programmatic atheism that emerged in the most radical of the ideologies that had been developing over the 100 years since Tom Paine.
Religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The demand to give up the illusion is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions.
Now, whatever Freud thought about the infantile origins of the illusion, for the Russian communists who had been influenced by the dialectical materialism of Karl Marx, it was an article of faith that the opium of religion would have no place in the forthcoming political millennium. They were determined to establish an illusion-free zone. And in Soviet Russia, indeed, they established what was, to all intents and purposes, the first fundamentally atheist state. The paradox is that a revolution which was designed to usher in a new golden era for humanity, tormented, tortured, imprisoned, and annihilated even more victims than Christianity at its most excessive. So it's hardly surprising that atheism has been indelibly, if unjustly, stained by its association. By the end of the 20th century, disbelief had become much more widespread than ever. And although it's not the whole story, there's no doubt that some of the appalling social catastrophes of the last 100 years have seriously undermined faith in a benevolent God. Of course, cruelty and misfortune have always been cited as reasons for doubt. But the inescapable publicity which these excesses now receive in the mass media represent an unprecedented problem for the pious. In fact, as we enter the 21st century, for many people, the questions of belief and disbelief seem scarcely worth considering. This brings me back to the very first person I talked to in this series, the English philosopher in New York, Colin McGinn.
Nobody spends their time trying to prove to others that the Greek gods don't exist. You know, you just decide that they don't, and that's the end of the story for you. So I like to distinguish atheism from anti-theism. Anti-theism is opposition to theism. I am an anti-theist because I believe that religion is harmful. I'm not just an atheist who's something, my only values are that I don't agree with it. I'm actively opposed to it. But then I distinguish that from what I call post-theism or post-atheism, which is the healthy state of mind where you've put all that behind you. Now, we can't do that yet because there's lots of religion in the world and lots of bad results of it. But to me, the ideal society would be one in which the question of religion didn't really arise for people, or if it did, it wasn't a heavy question for them. They would say to each other, you know, those humans used to believe back there in 2003, some of them believed there was this God and he did this, others didn't, and they did TV programs about why they didn't. What a funny debate that was, you know. So it would be a post-theist society where it wasn't an issue.
It's quite hard to imagine what the world would be like without religion. For the simple reason that, in one form or another, it's been with us for so long. And although the number of disbelievers is now larger than anyone could have imagined as little as 100 years ago, religion still permeates social life. And in some parts of the world, it's more consolidated and oppressive than ever. So that for those like myself, and there are literally millions of us for whom there is no religion, we still live in a world in which it's difficult to be unaware of its existence. For obvious reasons, it's some of the more fanatical developments which get me most worked up. The wilder excesses of Christian creationism, and of course the suicidal and sometimes the homicidal violence to be found in some parts of the Muslim world. But I'm also rattled by some of the more complacent assumptions, which I find amongst my friends and acquaintances, that my godlessness implies some sort of lack of seriousness on my part. That people like me have failed to recognize the existence of the soul, and above all, of its immortality. Well, to be quite frank, I find this somewhat impudent. The fact that I entertain no prospects whatever of some sort of subsequent existence doesn't mean that I'm indifferent to the fact that I, like everyone else, must die.